Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to this presentation of the Yearbook of the Euro 2022. I am the president of the Official Credit Institute Foundation. Firstly, let me please acknowledge our partner, the Foundation of Financial Studies. Jorge, thank you for being here today with us. And thank you, of course, to the Secretary of State and the Governor of the Bank of Spain, and Maria Demetrich, the Deputy Director at Bruegel, for joining us and bringing your views to this presentation of the new edition of the Euro Yearbook, coordinated by Fernando Fernandez. Thank you all for being here today. In the foundations, the director, Lucinio Muñoz, is with us. We are honored to co-edit the Yearbook of the Euro. This is the 9th edition. Nowadays, everybody knows the Official Credit Institute's role in supporting business and self-employed activities during the last 2 years through the management of the guarantee schemes approved by the government in public-private partnership cooperation with the financial sector and business associations. At the foundations, we support and reinforce the main goals of the Official Credit Institute as a national promotional bank to encourage growth, job creations and wealth distribution, and to contribute to the transformation of our economy towards a more sustainable, digital and inclusive model. Eco Foundation is focused on 3 main areas. On the one hand, in financial education and the promotion of economic and financial knowledge. Secondly, sustainable financing and circular economy, focusing on fostering knowledge and providing tools to increase above all small and medium-sized capability in these subjects through such activities as guides, seminars, and mentoring. And thirdly, alternative financing, raising awareness of the different instruments available, including venture capital, early stage, and young entrepreneurship. Let me give you a few ideas about the activities carried out by the foundations in the field of financial education. For example, through the foundation, we support Spanish talents through the cooperation with professional and vocational training, joining the force with high-profile mentors and state-of-the-art methods to train young students. We also take part in the National Financial Education Plan, together with the Ministry of Economy and Digital Transformation, with the Bank of Spain and the Spanish National Security Market, among other key players. Macroeconomic and financial debates is also one of the key areas of the foundations and is on our agenda. Every year, we bring classical economists' views and thinking to the current economic debate through classical economics collection, with the publications of some of the works of outstanding figures such as Pareto, Tobin, or Samuelson. And of course, last but not least, the Yearbook of the Euro. This is a key publication to take a stock of the state of the play of the main trends related to the policy in the Euro area. It also provides a deep insight and promotes the change of view as today on new proposals to strengthen and deepen the economic and monetary union. This year edition, as we will see during the debate and the presentation, includes, among other issues, an overview of the fiscal debates following the extraordinary efforts undertaken by the European Union and its member states in response to the sanitary crisis. On behalf of the Official Credit Institute Foundation, I would like also to express our gratitude to all those who have contributed to this year edition, and to all who, like Bruegel, is co-organizers of these events, and the law firm Uria, whose premises in Madrid are hosting this event, have made this presentation possible. I also want to thank to those of you who are in streaming and to those of you who are here with us today. And finally, I would like to give the floor to Fernando Fernandez, the coordinator of the Yearbook in the 9th edition, to give us a brief presentation about this edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose Carlos. It is a pleasure to present the 9th edition of the Yearbook once again here at Uria, and I want to thank the law firm for that. All of us embarked in this project share the common conviction that the world needs the European Union. If anything, this terrible COVID pandemic has reinforced our conviction. The Union has proven itself useful to its citizens. But this conviction should not lead us to complacency. The message design has some significant flaws that have not been reverted. Thus, the title of this 2022 yearbook, Good Policies, a Gap Year on Reforms. Yes, the Union adopted policies that have protected European economies and societies from the worst imaginable crisis. But none of the fundamental structural problems with the monetary union have been addressed. So also, yes, this has been a gap year. But let us not jump to conclusions. Allow me first to thank all contributors, an impressive group of very smart and dedicated professionals. Some of them are here in the room. I will not mention them individually. I don't want to take the risk of forgetting some of them. They all know my gratitude and can only be proud to have been able to gather them around the yearbook. They know that, as usual, I do not always agree with them. In fact, they don't even agree among themselves. And this year, the points of discussion have been significant. The nature of the inflationary spike and the adequate monetary policy response, the continuation of the fiscal impulse, the role of fiscal policy in the Union and the design of the new fiscal rules, the contribution of monetary policy to the greening of the European economy. But this is precisely the beauty of the yearbook. And my personal interpretation of the reason for the success of these 9 consecutive years of publication, that we strive to present all sides to the European debate, all arguments, with analytical rigor and the strongest European conviction. We simply want to help to educate the public, and hopefully to educate policymakers, on the implications of the different proposals and policies on the table. Something we could not have done without the continuous understanding of support of our sponsors, la Fundación de Estudios Financieros y la Fundación ICO. Thank you, Jorge, and thank you, José Carlos, personally, for your continuous support through these years. Despite the remarkable European success in medical research and vaccination, the health situation still conditions the economic outlook and darkens the social and political climate. Economic recovery has been slower and less intense than anticipated. Uncertainty about the consequences of the new COVID variants remains pervasive. The damage to our productive capacity may be long-lasting, and inflation has proven more acute and persistent. In short, the new normal is not here yet, and it looks more challenging than ever. Nevertheless, there is a clear motive for European satisfaction, because the Union has not only resisted, but it has come out reinforced. The European Union has evolved with this crisis to become a major political actor. The pandemic has made the Union necessary and the policies more centralized. And surprisingly, the European divide has also become deeper and at times more confrontational. But it is a remarkable success that despite all these problems, no European member state has fallen to the final populist dream of abandoning the Union, or even risking to do so. The European Union has proven itself a collective insurance against the known dangers of nationalism, sectarism, and war, and the unknown perils of a pandemic and any other potential global black swan. But the story of the European Monetary Union cannot be equally defined as an indisputable success. In our last yearbook, we commended the Union for its swift and determined policy response to the pandemic. And we ask ourselves, and I quote, of all the emergency programs implemented in the crisis year of 2020, which ones will become lasting parts of the European architecture? The truth is that today, at the start of 2022, we're still not closer to answer that question. We still do not know. Because there has been no progress in completing monetary and banking union in any of the 4 key areas. The European deposit insurance system to avoid the bank sovereign risk doom loop, risk reduction by limiting the exposure of banks' balance sheets to their home sovereign, the elimination of the possibilities to evade the European resolution mechanism and to apply national solvency rules in search of leniency to national creditors and protecting ailing national champions, or to facilitate cross-border mergers and acquisitions in the financial industry. The same argument could apply to fiscal union. After the suspension of state aid rules and of excessive deficit and debt procedures, fiscal policy in the euro area became immensely expensive, facilitated by the ECB pandemic emergency purchase program. This was indeed the right policy for the Union in an exogenous emergency. But it is questionable whether it remains appropriate now in the recovery. Yes, the Union has put in place a historic Next Generation EU, but so far it is still a one-time program to address an emergency, not a macro stabilization facility the Union needs. Consequently, the European Monetary Union still lacks a euro area fiscal stance and has not moved towards a new consensus on fiscal rules. Moreover, although NGEU implies issuing large volumes of European debt, it is not necessarily the euro-wide asset, safe European asset the Union needs. One could therefore argue that while the economic policy responses to the pandemic has been adequate and consistent, the European Monetary Union has not used the crisis to advance its structural agenda. An optimistic Europhile would argue that the Union rightly prioritized cohesion and efficiency over completing the European agenda. And by doing so, it has gained legitimacy and popular capital to confront the difficult times ahead. But a pessimistic Eurosceptic could also argue and would remind us that the real debates have been postponed, precisely because we have not moved any closer towards a new consensus. And the two opposite visions of the monetary union still remain well established in the respective corners, politically and geographically. That the crisis, in a certain sense, has been wasted for reform. This 2022 yearbook opens with the initial chapter describing the political landscape in a union in search of its place in a new world of more determined and apologetic economic giants. And then it is organized in the three traditional areas of concern to our report: monetary, fiscal, and regulatory. Part 1 of monetary policy explains in detail the rationale and content of the revised ECB strategy and extends into two current market concerns. Is this time different with inflation? And does the Union need a central bank digital currency? And what would be the implications of introducing one? The reader would also find in this section significant new issues, like why should monetary policy worry about climate change? And if it worries, what instruments are better suited to that effect? Part 2 describes and assesses the anti-pandemic fiscal policy in the Union and the implication for member states. Then it asks whether the EU should change its fiscal rules and in what direction. A debate of the utmost importance because it will impact on the foreseeable trajectory, not only of fiscal balances, but also on the medium-term outlook for disposable income, employment, and output. A final chapter discusses whether we should worry about debt levels and fiscal sustainability. Finally, part 3 includes a diverse set of regulatory topics with a European dimension. What is the Union doing, if anything, to guide member states and financial intermediaries in dealing with non-performing loans in the aftermath of the pandemic? What to expect of the regulatory treatment of climate risks and how will it impact required levels of capital and provisions? And how capital markets help the consolidation of the euro as an international reserve currency of choice. The issues are on the table, opinions and proposals are plenty. I have tried to guide the reader in my executive summary through these issues. Some of the authors may question whether I misguided the reader, but this anonymous reader may actually at the end would end with a very European sense of mixed satisfaction and disappointment. Satisfaction for everything that has been accomplished, and disappointment for what needs to be accomplished, needs still to be accomplished. In my view, the Union is too much dependent, the monetary union is still too much dependent on market benevolence. Let's just hope it continues. Finally, as the readers know, I usually end up the yearbook with my 10 personal European lessons. I will only state them very briefly here to excite the reading of the yearbook. And in doing so, it will probably sound a little bit provocative and sometimes aggressive. First, the Union has once again shown its extraordinary flexibility to respond to new situations with new programs, initiatives, and policies. Politicians are this time to be commended. Second, the times they are changing, but this time is not different. Inflation is not dead, and the Union should not act as if it has died. Third, the new monetary strategy of the ECB is a welcome initiative, but the long-term consequences are uncharted territory. Policymakers should not act and should not use the monetary strategy as an excuse for not advancing in completing banking union. Fourth, the digitalization of money is a reality, but the Union should not fall prey to technological infatuation and believe that the new digital world will free money and banking from its fundamentals. Fifth, Next Generation EU has been a very adequate economic response to COVID, but it is not, it cannot be the necessary macro stabilization facility EMU needs. A stabilization facility must be centralized, quick in design and disbursement, and linked to asymmetric shocks in member states' economy, to GDP and employment shocks. Sixth, the stabilization facility needs to be accompanied by clear, enforceable fiscal rules to prevent free riding and build trust among member states. Fiscal rules require some necessary additional transfer of sovereignty to European authorities. Seventh, the high level of public indebtedness as a result of the great financial crisis and this pandemic creates an urgent need for a smart medium-term fiscal consolidation, particularly in member states with higher debt ratios. Eighth, extraordinary regulatory and prudential policies have avoided a new credit crunch, but these measures cannot be extended indefinitely. Instruments that have been proven useful in the past, like securitization and asset management companies, will most likely require public money. Ninth, green finances are still at an infant stage, but European authorities seem determined to advance them rapidly and forcefully. A word of caution is thus necessary to ensure global political consideration and avoid unnecessary competitive disadvantages to the European financial industry. And 10th, the international role of the euro was pushed back by the great financial crisis. Fostering that role calls for completing the banking and the capital market union and harmonizing regulatory approaches and methodologies. And with that wish list in mind, and surprisingly sticking to the timetable, and now thank you for your attention, and I will introduce the speakers of the fiscal debate. We have the luxury to have with us one of the contributors to the yearbook, Maria de Mercis, and the Secretary of State for the Economy, Gonzalo Garcia. Let me briefly mention their curriculums. Maria de Mercis is Deputy Director of Bruegel, PhD in Economics at the University of Strathclyde, previously worked at the Dutch Central Bank, the European Commission, and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And as most of you know, and certainly in your home in Bruegel, Maria, she's a regular commentator in national and international press, television, and radio, and has published extensively in international academic journals. Gonzalo Garcia Andres is the Secretary of State for Economy and Support of Business in the Spanish Ministry of Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation. Prior to his appointment as Secretary of State, he was managing partner of economics at Analistas Financieros Internacionales, a leading Spanish economic consulting firm. He has spent most of his professional career as the Minister of Economy, specifically in the areas of Treasury, international finance, and macroeconomic policy. He was Director General of International Finance and Economic and Commercial Counsel of the Spanish Embassy in Washington, D.C., and I dare to say a good friend of mine, which is the reason why he's here, and I thank him for that. Okay, without further ado, let's have this debate. Maria, if you wish, could you introduce your views on fiscal rules, and then I'm sure we'll have Gonzalo's discussion. Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Fernando. And before I say a few words on these issues, I just wanted to personally thank you for involving us every year. I myself, since I've been at Bruegel, have been almost every year involved in the yearbook. And every year I'm delighted at the depth and breadth of the issues that the yearbook addresses when it comes to European and Monetary Union architectural issues. And every year you shift the debate and you never cease to provoke us, which I think is absolutely essential if we are to move the debate forward. And of course, I'd like to thank all the stakeholders for putting the yearbook together, and once again for including Bruegel and personally into this effort. So this year, Fernando very kindly asked me to comment on the debate of the year, if I may call it this way, which is going to be the return to some sort of fiscal architecture. Last year, maybe it was the year of debating the monetary architecture. This year, we're debating the fiscal architecture, very much driven by events, namely the suspension of the rules, the suspension of the rules during the pandemic, but also the need to return to some sort of fiscal planning, fiscal coordination as we are coming to a tail end of the pandemic. With that, of course, a note of caution: we are not out of the pandemic, and there is remarkable uncertainty as to how this pandemic and when the pandemic will turn into something much more normal. And that, of course, will have repercussions for our discussions here and for the policy measures that we need to take to fend off some of the economic consequences. But just for today, I would like to make 3 comments when it comes to the fiscal debate. The paper that we submitted in the book has got a lot more detail. We believe the details is important here, but I'd just like to concentrate on the 3 big issues which I think should really direct the discussions that we'll be having in the course of this year, possibly next year. The first one is that the fiscal architecture that we have in place currently, we have had since the beginning of EMU, namely the Maastricht architecture, which, by the way, we celebrate 30 years of this year, was, of course, very valid in terms of its rationale, in my view, but I think the rules were designed wrong. And I will explain what I mean by that. Then the second issue I'd like to point out is then what to do about it, how to try and perhaps remedy some of the things that the current architecture does not address. And then the third point that I'd like to make, and it actually plays right into some of the things that Fernando says, is that what to do after that is not just about the rules themselves, it's about a bigger picture and how to think about fiscal policy in a world which in the next 30 years will be very different to the world that we had when we actually designed the current architecture. So point 1, the rules are wrong. If I may also be a little bit provocative, why are they wrong? The rationale behind the rules was driven very much by the externalities debate, namely fiscal behavior in one country has repercussion on others. So if one country takes fiscal decisions that are not disciplined, they're not correct, it will actually have a reverberation effects on other countries and therefore will jeopardize the sustainability of the euro, of the European Monetary Union. That rationale is still valid, and all the more why we need to pay attention to it. But the way the rules were designed back in the Maastricht Treaty were only catering for monitoring fiscal positions. They were not catering for coordinated fiscal positions. And actually that led to wrong outcomes. What do I mean by that? Fiscal policy, instead of being counter-cyclical, it ended up being pro-cyclical. And at the same time, when the belt had to be tight, in other words, in bad times, the first thing that took a hit was investment. So in other words, we were sacrificing the future in the benefit of the present, which is something that, of course, can go very wrong in the long term. So the fiscal rules did not achieve good fiscal outcomes. This is basically the reason why I believe the fiscal rules were not correct, and it will be absolutely essential to try and remedy that. Now, the procyclicality of fiscal policy means that in good times, we spend more, and in bad times we spend less or we cut. But the role of fiscal policy is one of insurance. Actually, Fernando even used this word in the context of something else, in the context of monetary union. But I think it's important to see fiscal policy as an insurance mechanism, whereby in the good times we build up the buffers so that in the bad times we can actually run down the buffers and sustain a level of welfare that is pretty much stable. So it is absolutely essential that we use fiscal policy in a counter-cyclical way, and we don't jeopardize investments. So that brings me to my second point, how to do that. I would like to believe that there is consensus among experts, at least, and actually beyond experts, that agree that how to reform these rules. I even also believe that, politically speaking, we are now in a much better position to try and reform those rules in the directions where everybody agrees. But I will share some of the skepticism that Fernando also had in his introductory remarks, that the political capital that is probably needed to reform these rules effectively and sustainably may not necessarily convincingly be there. So that, of course, will be a real pity, but at least we have a good understanding of how to reform these rules. In the paper, we discuss in great detail what we think ought to happen. I will summarize it by saying 2 things. We need to move away from monitoring rules that are difficult to monitor. And by that, I mean rules that rely on measures of variables that are not either actual, namely they're theoretical, or they're difficult to measure. So I would like to move us away from measures of GDP rules rather and move into other types of rules. And the one that we prefer the most is an expenditure rule, which is something that is in the hands of the policymakers and is perfectly controllable as far as measures is concerned. That's one thing. And the other thing is we need to find ways not to sacrifice investments for the benefit of the future, for the benefit of the present. This is absolutely essential, in particular when it comes to the two big transformations that our economy will necessarily have to go through, namely climate and digital. So rules that can be measured and rules that ensure we have a minimal amount of investments that is absolutely necessary for the future. So the one thing that I believe needs to happen is we need to design something along the lines of what is known now as a golden green rule. Basically, we exclude green investments from any of these centrally controlled Maastricht rules. Now, that much I actually think will happen. And that brings me now to my third point, but I don't believe that this is necessarily sufficient. The role of fiscal policy in the next 30 years is not the same, will not be the same as the role of fiscal policy, the way that we understood it back in the 1990s when we designed the rules. At the time, we thought of fiscal policy very much as a fiscal stabilization tool, but only around the cycle. The role of fiscal policy in the future will have a pivotal, will be pivotal in terms of driving investments that will attract private capital to actually satisfy the investment needs that we have. So I think fiscal policy will have a much more active role, and I haven't even talked about stabilization, which is what Fernando talked about. I think just simply on the investment side, the role of fiscal policy is going to be very active. Even if we have a fiscal green rule that allows countries to exclude green investments from these centrally controlled rules, not all countries will have the fiscal space to do so, exactly for the reasons that also Fernando alluded to. We will come out of this crisis very highly indebted, and not all countries will have similar space to invest on climate issues, even if they are allowed to. And by that I mean without jeopardizing the fiscal sustainability. I don't think it is wise to take any investment or consumption actions on the fiscal side if that is going to jeopardize the fiscal sustainability. That is not sustainable. So if we cannot invest, if we don't have the space, or at least some countries, and certainly beyond the RRF, beyond the Next Generation EU horizon, namely 6 years from now, what do we do then? And here, just like Fernando, I'd like to hope that we could think about a fiscal architecture that goes beyond the rules. We can think of alternative ways of doing that. We have the RRF as a template of centralizing some power and actually creating what Fernando called collective insurance that is going to help us invest in certainly the climate transformation at a minimal speed that is acceptable for all and consistent with our very ambitious climate objectives. I fear that unless we do that, we are not going to meet our climate goals, which is of course something that in my view should not be uncompromisable. My last point there, and I will close here, is that the climate challenge is so important that we cannot allow ourselves to design a new fiscal architecture bound by the current treaty. It's not consistent to talk about the urgency of climate and at the same time trying to design a reaction to climate that is bound by treaties that were signed in a different era. So this is the time to rethink how we can redesign a treaty that will be consistent, not with the ambitions of the past, but with the ambitions of the future. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you, Fernando.
Maria, for your insightful and certainly provocative comments. Gonzalo, if you can comment, discuss, and present your own views. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, and good morning, Maria. Thank you so much for your thoughts and also for your very, I think, valuable contribution in the yearbook. Your article with Gregory. I will start by trying to put the debate in the perspective with three elements. One, where do we stand? I think it's good to have some hindsight on the process in the monetary union and the debate on fiscal rules. Second, what is the new framework, the new macro framework for the future? We need to kind of evolve from the debates of the past, sometimes very futile and not very productive debates, and look forward and try to see what we need and what will be the conditions that will shape what we do. And finally, in terms of the content of the rules and the timing, what we think is a sensible approach. Well, we know that the euro is a creature that is now in its early 20s, but has had a very turbulent teenage years that I think were very tough, but I think very fortunately from that turbulence we've learned. And I think it's today as it was in 1999 or a little earlier when the framework was being discussed, as in fiscal rules are essential, but not just fiscal rules. I think we have come to have a widely shared view about the essential element and function of the fiscal dimension of monetary union to work well. So this debate about fiscal rules is just part of that, I think, bigger fiscal dimension, which I think we understand. It's a very difficult debate, one that it's politically and technically very complex, but one that we essentially need to kind of make progress on in order to have kind of a more robust and solid future in terms of economic outcomes for the monetary union. And it's true that I think, well, Maria kind of expressed it very vividly that you know, for most of this time of the life of the euro, we haven't got it right or completely right in terms of the rules. I think the good news here is that we didn't get it right until we finally did. And I'm going to refer to, I think, what was a critical moment, which was the spring of 2020. At that point, we realized that in the span of 2 weeks, we were witnessing a new systemic crisis in the euro area kind of unfolding at an incredible speed. And this time, I think, you know, the response of all policymakers in the monetary union, the euro system, but also the European Council and EU institutions and national governments, I think, has been up to the huge challenge posed by the economic consequence of the pandemic. And I think that has to give us confidence, because we have made a lot of progress in responding to this crisis. We know, looking back to the European project, it is always by kind of coming together when there's a need and when the value of acting together is essential, that the project kind of advances. And I think this has been a wonderful example of that dynamic. So, second, we can approach this debate with confidence, because I think that we have given kind of a very substantial step in terms of the institutional framework. It is true that Next Generation EU is an exceptional and temporary framework, but all that are in this debate, we are all well aware that we have kind of given a step that is far-reaching in terms of what it means for this fiscal dimension. So I think we also need to look at how the economy has recovered from this crisis, and get also that confidence that this has not been by chance, because as Maria was reminding us, you know, pandemic is still there, you know, the potential for, you know, financial implications of the very sharp drop in economic activity, of having hysteresis, that was huge. And really, I think the response has been very, very effective, not just by Next Generation EU, but we've also had some hints of stabilization mechanisms as the SURE program. So I think all in all, in the last 2 years, I think with terrible times that we've had to live through, I think we have made progress. What is that we need for the future? Because as also I think Fernando mentioned it, and Maria also stressed it, and I think it's very well kind of explained in the article, is we have a new macro landscape. We need to think of what fiscal rules we need for this macro landscape. Of course, yes, we have higher debt as a result of in part of this kind of smart and effective response to the pandemic crisis. We have lower real interest rates, despite the changes that we're seeing recently, and that of course has a direct implication about debt reduction pace and about the kind of the gradual approach to debt reduction. And of course, we have the transformation of the economy driven by the digital and by the green levers, the urgency to accelerate the green transformation, and also the great opportunity to deploy that digital technology and reap the whole benefits in terms of productivity and better policies that digital has. For that, we need a sustainable investment drive, one that has a public component that is stable and is sustained, and also kind of a framework that is conducive to having the same thing in the private sector. It's absolutely essential. They need to go together. For this, we don't only need to have rules that ensure that that we can have collectively at national level, but also at European level, these levels of investment that are needed to kind of to reach our goals, the goals that we have fixed ourselves in terms of not just in terms of sustainable growth, but in terms of decarbonization. But we also need reforms. We also need regulation, and they need to go together. And we're seeing that with the implementation of the recovery and resilience plans. This is a process that is not just about the money. We need to have the capacity to kind of design those projects, to execute those projects, and to have the huge potential economic impact that they need. And for that, we need to complement the investment and stable investment with reforms and regulations at national level and at EU level. And third, in terms of the rules, I think we very much in the ministry, and I think the Spanish government, we very much share many of the elements that are in the article and that Maria outlined. We think we need to kind of reintroduce the rules with changes, significant changes, to adapt it to the needs that we have, and to the kind of significant shifts that have happened in the macro and the financial landscape. We agree that we need simpler rules, ones that are easier to kind of monitor and enforce. We think that we have to reduce debt. We will have the data, first data on the debt to GDP ratio today for 2021 for Spain. We will see that we have already started to reduce that debt to GDP, and of course we need to rebuild those buffers for the futures. We need the debt reduction. We need the fiscal rules to do the right thing in terms of ensuring stability, but we need to make it consistent with with having this sustained recovery in output and in employment, and for that we need to be flexible in debt reduction. In terms of enforcement, we also need to learn for things that have not worked in the past, and I think the ownership here is very important. and also the medium-term element, which is for good fiscal policy is essential. And then there's the element of making the rules accommodate that level of investment that we need. You know, there are different estimates of the investment needs for the future, you know, up to 2030 or even to 2050. They are all very, you know, huge in terms of public and private investment, and we need to acknowledge the need for fiscal rules to allow those levels of investments to go through. This does not mean that we're going to sacrifice, you know, fiscal stability for investment, because if we have high quality expenditure and we have good investment, that will be a force for fiscal stability that will kind of increase potential growth, that will make it easier to engage in debt reduction. So I think this is absolutely essential. Now there's a debate on how to kind of make it happen, how to introduce this in the rules. There are different options. It's not always easy to kind of have this different categories in terms of having to identify investments that will be treated differently. That's a complex problem. And there's also this very interesting idea about European public goods and kind of ensuring that there's a mechanism that is a common mechanism to kind of allow and finance those investments that really are contributing to European policies and that are European public goods in a way. And finally, there's the timing. You know, we think we need to move fast and we need to be pragmatic. I'm not, you know, in what Fernando kind of depicted as Europhile or, you know, Eurosceptic. You know, I think we have grounds to be confident and to build on the success that we've had responding to a very, very critical situation. And that, I think, that kind of the force that we have now, that I think more constructive atmosphere among policymakers. We need to use that capital to come up to, you know, an agreement about kind of a pragmatic reform to the rules that allows us in 2023 to kind of have these rules reinstated, but already with all these elements introduced. This will not be the end of the process. This is always an incremental process. We need to be I think confident and patient. We need to move step by step. This is the next step. We of course our priorities are very focused on the implementation of the recovery and resilience plans. That I think will give us a lot of traction in terms of growth and in terms of structural transformation, because let me remind the crucial part that the structural reforms play in the implementation and recovery and resilience plans. So let's move swift. Let's not engage. Let's not go back to the old debates, to the old divides, which will not be productive. That's what we are advocating in this process. I think we all agree that fiscal policy will need to play a bigger role. That of course does not mean that that will be detrimental to the commitment to fiscal stability. Not at all. I think if we do it in a smart way, it will be something that will help us kind of continue to advance in terms of debt reduction. And I think we have the opportunity to continue to learn. I think we have learned a lot of our mistakes. This is how we advance in Europe. And I think that this debate, current debate about the fiscal rules, is the opportunity to give another step in this process. And of course, there will be others to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Maria, let me quickly ask you a couple of questions, both of you. Picking on some of the points that you mentioned, I was particularly interested on your sentence or qualifying sentence of fiscal rules that have to evolve from monitoring to coordinating. So I guess you're directly, if I understand you correctly, you're aiming towards having some way to define the fiscal impulse for the euro area. How do you see that? I mean, how do you see in practice this fiscal impulse being defined and arrive within the institutional context of the European Monetary Union? Because, you know, the problem is we have to bring down the rules from the world of theoretical proposals to the real life of politicians. And Gonzalo, you have some way to, some hints here I will be welcome. You know, how do we bring this need for coordinating to defining a fiscal impulse for the euro area, whatever that might be, positive or negative, depending on the economic cycle, of course. That's one issue. The second point I'd like you to comment is on this green golden rule that both of you seem to be in certain ways advising. As you know, I have a couple of questions with it, but one fundamental. I mean, let's assume we do need a drastic investments to avoid climate change. Are you proposing to assume that investment with additional fiscal pressure, or are we talking about substituting some of the current expenditures in any given treasury to make room for public investment? Because that, as you said, sustainable investment drive will have to be financed. So is the net outcome of this that the euro area debt to GDP levels will increase substantially for a good cause, but nevertheless increase? Or are you talking about, because this is again the nuts and bolts of fiscal policy. And then, well, leave it there. I don't want to extend to it, but there's this general rule, if you want to comment, because Gonzalo, you talk about that, and I think it's very important to move beyond fiscal rules to a more fiscal dimension of the monetary union, which I think is relevant. I think it indirectly, to me, this leads me to talk about how do we build the Euro-wide safe asset, which needs to be public. You know, this is a big issue here, but if you want to pick on this, I would like you to. So Maria, and then Gonzalo, or whatever.
Yeah, thank you. Sure, yeah, absolutely, and thank you, Fernando, for this, because these are effectively the important questions to ask to move forward. Let me just first thank Gonzalo also for his intervention. It's very difficult to disagree with anything he said, but also thank him for reminding us how much we have actually achieved. And certainly the comparison between the policy reaction of this crisis to the financial crisis really is lessons learned. And I think that is commendable. And I think it's important that we are reminded of that and not only be critical about the things we haven't done. So that's just what I wanted to say about that. So then, Fernando, to your points, how to coordinate and not just monitor. And then how do we divide the pie when it comes to the fiscal basket between expenditure and consumption? And if I may say, actually, I think the answer to these are probably related. Effectively, where do we find fiscal capacity to deal with common problems? Now, I remind you that for within the current fiscal pact, countries submit their budgets to the European Commission, and that is part of the process, and then the process of monitoring begins. I think what needs to happen as a step forward there is to ensure that the fiscal position that is being submitted to the European Commission is also appropriate when it comes to this counter-cyclical, pro-cyclical. This is the next step that, of course, is a delicate one, because you are taking the decisions over a sovereign state and you are not necessarily eliminating the sovereignty, but you are also putting it on the plate of the Union. That is the political economy of it is not an easy one. But I think we need to appreciate that unless we do that, we're going to end up in having a fiscal policy of the past. I don't want to go in that spectrum between fiscal autonomy, national fiscal autonomy, and full national federalism. I don't want to move much more in the federalistic side, because I think that's very difficult. It's very difficult, and it requires a very different debate in order to be able to get there. I would like us to move in a slightly more coordination way within the state of sovereignty that we have chosen to pursue till now. That doesn't mean that it's not democratically legitimate to move some of the decisions more centrally in more coordinated fashion with more political legitimacy. And here I think the RRF and the Next Generation EU gives us a very good template to think about. The governance of the RRF and the next generation EU needs to be tested. But if it is successful, and I really hope it becomes successful, then this is a perfect template to take in the future and possibly make it permanent effectively. It is not a surrender of greater sovereignty, and it recognizes the fact that certain things need to be covered centrally, and it has nothing to do with the loss of sovereignty. So if you were to follow that path, then that gives us much more space to think about the answer to your second question, Fernando, which is how do we jeopardize expenditures in order to invest? I think that the bulk of this decision still needs to be at the country level, certainly on the expenditure side. And I also believe that expenditure needs to be financed by current means, namely taxation. But when it comes to investments, and particularly investments on what it is, without no doubt, European public goods, dare I say global public goods, but we're talking about the European architecture here, they need to be financed both more centrally, but also they need to be financed intergenerationally, meaning with debt. And finding convincing, and by convincing I mean sustainable ways of doing this investment is justified because you're talking about European public goods. And I think that is the element there. And stronger, if we don't do that, I think, and you leave this decision to the countries, as I said earlier on, I think not all countries will have the space to do that. And I haven't even mentioned, of course, the incentive for greenwashing, which is basically countries will simply try to bypass the rules and give us investments that are not necessarily green, because that is a way of dealing with some of the political economy issues. So I would like us to move a little bit more to the right when it comes the right being in advancing towards more centralization of certain issues, but do it only on long-term issues. Do it for investments because they need to be consistent with our climate ambitions. So, in your intervention, Fernando, you talked about a stabilization tool at the euro area. Irrespective of the merits of that, I think this is second order. In terms of the political economy that we face here. If I had to invest political capital on one issue, it would be the long-term investments for climate and possibly the transformation, very much a la RRF. And that is why I think we need to look at the next generation EU as the template for moving forward.
Let's hope you're right, and the fiscal stabilization facility for the euro area is a secondary necessity, that the situation doesn't turn that we need it much sooner than anticipated. But anyway, Gonzalo.
Yes,
yeah,
I think no, of course. I think two of the points you raised, Fernando, one on the euro safe asset, one on the investment. I think it's not at all about saying let's permanently kind of have higher debt because we will have more investment. It's have a different kind of combination of elements that will end up being, I think, better in terms of reducing the debt. Because these will mean that there will be more discipline on the part of expenditure that does not include investment, and that there will be kind of better incentives for governments to kind of protect their expenditure on investment. Of course, if you make the numbers, you might think that that will have a kind of very direct one-to-one effect on that, but I don't think that will be the case if that investment will turn to kind of support the growth and the whole quality of expenditure improves, and that will in terms of the dynamics of the debt to GDP might very well having a positive impact. And that I think that's the conversation that we need to have in terms of doing this smartly. One other element that I think you haven't mentioned, but I think it's good to bear in mind for this debate is that compared to other economic areas, fiscal kind of metrics of the euro area, this in spite and even after this very kind of strong response, fiscal policy response, are better than others. So I think we're in a good position. Of course, there's a lot of difference within the euro area. There are differences in the debt to GDP. I think it is essential that those kind of structural divergences are, reconduced in a way, and I think the way to do that again is to link investment and the quality of fiscal policy also with reform. I think here the issue of reforms and having the incentives for countries to kind of pursue structural reforms, I think it's an essential element that can, add an element of quality to expenditure, and also an element of growth, dynamism, and policies that are, I think, are better in qualitative terms. In terms of the euro asset, I think, of course, again, this is a very kind of difficult debate. Long term, we thought, and we were told that we wouldn't see any advance in terms of the safe European asset. How much money has the European Commission issued so far? It's almost 100 billion euro. That will continue. That will be in the market. That is already something that's already a reality, and we will have to build from that. Of course, this is not permanent. This is we're doing this. We are in the context of doing this, and that's why it's so important that we do this right. You mentioned, I think it's and also I think it's in the article of Maria and Gregory. Next Generation EU, it's not the stabilization tool, yes, but it's a tool of very smart fiscal policy and economic policy. I think we are seeing some of the initial results of this very smart policy. Let's concentrate on doing this right. I think in the whole of Europe, but particularly in some of the countries that are, I think, more essential in this debate because of the difference in the level of debt in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, in Portugal. Let's show that this works, because that will give the confidence to our colleagues, in the Netherlands, in Germany, that going in this direction, it's a productive way forward.
Well, thank you very much, Maria and Gonzalo, for a very interesting discussion. We're a bit late, but with that, I think it was worthwhile to have this discussion. And with that in mind, I pass on the floor to Jorge Izaguirre, which is the president of the Fundación de Estudios Financieros, to introduce our next guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Well, it's my duty to introduce you, Pablo Hernández de Cos, sorry. Pablo Hernández de Cos is governor of the Bank of Spain and a member of the ECB Governing Council. He's also chairman of the Basel Committee of Banking Supervision and chairman of the Technical Advisory Committee and a member of the Steering Committee of the European Systemic Risk Board. A member of the Financial Stability Board, the group of governors and heads of supervision, and the Advisory Council of the Financial Stability Institute of the Bank for International Settlement and the Center for Latin American Monetary Studies. He holds a PhD in economics for the Complutense University in Madrid, a degree in economics and business administration from CUNEF, and a degree in law from UNED. Pablo, thank you very much for being here. We are very happy for that, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I will stay here if I'm allowed, because I have a better view of the screen, and since I'll be using some slides, I think it's at least it's better for me. No, of course, thank you, Jorge, Juan Carlos, the stakeholders, Fundación ICO, Instituto Español de Analistas Financieros, Fundación de Estudios Financieros. But perhaps let me stress my thanks to Fernando, that we know he's the soul, I guess also the body, or even the brain of this very, very important initiative. Thank you, Fernando, for the invitation again to participate, not only today, but also in the book. Yeah, as it was introduced by José Carlos at the very beginning, I will be talking today about the ECB monetary policy strategy. When Fernando asked me in the spring last year about the possibility of writing an article in this yearbook, I was, of course, offering the possibility of incorporating a description of the new monetary policy strategy that in the end was approved in July by the Governing Council of the European Central Bank. What I didn't know is that at that time it was going to be so essential also from the more conjunctural perspective, no? And this was going to be one of the main points of my presentation today, which is just for sure to present the motivation, to present the outcome, to present the rationale for this monetary policy strategy, but at the same time, in parallel, to try to also to convey the message that it is the right framework, that it provides the right tools precisely to fight against a situation as the one that we are currently facing, which is this high inflation episode. So I will structure my remarks into three parts. First, I will explain why, given the profound structural changes that the euro area has experienced in recent decades, it was appropriate, it was needed to have this strategy review. In particular, I will talk about the fall in the natural interest rate that has taken place over the last few decades, and how this secular process, if I can put it this way, has imposed in terms of limitations on the conduct of monetary policy. Second, I will set out the main aspects. I will describe the main aspects of the ECB's new monetary policy strategy. Here, if I may, I will keep it short. I will focus on those elements that I think are particularly relevant in the current context. There are many other issues, including climate, that we're also mentioning, Fernando, in your introductory remarks. But I think, I mean, you can, of course, read my article and, of course, the review itself, the one that was published by the European Central Bank. But I think it's perhaps better to focus here today on the more relevant elements from the monetary policy perspective. Yeah, higher? Yeah. Okay, I'll try. And then finally, I will try to make this connection with the current inflation episodes, and I mean, why is this framework the appropriate one to face the current circumstances? Yeah. Okay. Let me start. Well, maybe I should start by saying what a monetary policy strategy is about. Okay, because perhaps it's not so obvious for many people. So in the euro area case, in the European Central Bank case, you know that the Treaty of the European Union confers on the ECB the primary mandate of maintaining price stability in the euro area as a whole. However, you may also know that it leaves to the discretion of the ECB the exact definition of price stability, and not only the definition of price stability, but also the manner in which this goal is to be achieved. And the combination of this definition and the manner in which this goal is to be achieved is what it is known as the monetary policy strategy. In 1998, the ECB defined price stability as a year-on-year increase in the harmonized index of consumer prices, the so-called HICP, of below 2%. Okay, that was the first definition that we had. In 2003, the Governing Council of the ECB clarified that its aim was to maintain inflation rates below but close to 2% over the mean term. It was not a complete new strategy, but it was a clarification at that time that was considered appropriate. And then this 2000 strategy review stated as well that, well, in order to achieve the ECB goal, the ECB would use the three key interest rates, the deposit facility rate, the DFR, the marginal lending facility rate, and the rate on the main refinancing operations. From the very beginning, and I think this is an important point, the monetary policy strategy was not thought to be an static concept. Okay, so it was perceived from the very beginning that there might be reasons, there might be structural changes in the economy, in the euro area, that would evolve over time, and that should, of course, lead to changes in the monetary policy strategy of the ECB. So, well, what were the achievements of this strategy? Well, here what you have in this chart is the evolution of HICP, of the goal of the ECB. And well, it's pretty obvious from this chart that during the first decade of the euro, inflation remained close to target levels in a context of, well, mainly inflationary pressures. Okay, the shocks that were hitting the euro area were mainly inflationary. But then there was a clear trigger point, which was the global financial crisis in 2008, that led to a phase essentially dominated by these inflationary shocks. And during this phase that extended until 2020, I would say, inflation was persistently, and as it is obvious from the chart, below the target level. And this is the main point and one of the main motivations of the strategy review. This is related to some structural changes that have taken place in the euro area economy over the previous 2 decades. And so it became clear that the strategy needed to be revised. In particular, I don't know what has happened. I'm not... Yeah, okay. In particular, to understand why inflation in the euro area remained below target for more than a decade, despite the fact that the ECB maintained a very accommodative monetary policy stance, one must necessarily take into account the secular decline in the natural interest rate and the limitations that such a decline imposes through what it is called the lower bound on interest rates. Well, the equilibrium or natural interest rate is defined as the real interest rate that simultaneously maintains output at its potential level and inflation stable at its target level. And this rate, which cannot be observed directly, can only be estimated, we know, with some degree, of course, of uncertainty, as usual, using economic techniques. And in this chart, you have some of the estimates that are produced at the Bank of Spain, and also by other academia and also other institutions. So according to these estimates, that are presented in the chart, the natural interest rate appears to have progressively declined in recent decades, not only, by the way, in the euro area, but in general, more in general in advanced economies. And in the case of the euro area, estimates even place it at negative levels. Okay, as you can see with the most recent figures in this chart. Well, what are the reasons behind this secular drop in R-start? Well, among other factors, this is related, or at least the empirical and the theoretical analysis that has been done by many economists during the last decades. It is connected to first lower productivity growth, the negative trend on lower productivity growth. Also certain demographic developments, in particular aging of population, and also widening inequality. Okay, these are the 3 main reasons that economists justify or put as a justification for this decline in interest rates. The combination of all these factors, well, what has changed is basically the balance between the supply of savings and the demand for investment, and this is what it translates into this decline in the natural interest rate. Yeah. Okay, I'm trying. So then, of course, the question is, why is this important for monetary policy? Okay, and the answer is clear. Well, we know that according to monetary policy theory, in order to achieve the inflation target, a central bank must maintain real interest rate, that is the nominal rate less expected inflation, at the level of the natural interest rate. Okay, that's the main element that we have to take into account. Well, given that prices are partly rigid, okay, the central bank may move the real interest rates, which are the relevant one, of course, for economic agents, in line with the changes in the natural interest rate by adjusting nominal interest rates. Okay. So within this framework, the decline in the natural interest rate I was describing means that in order to stabilize inflation, real interest rates and therefore nominal interest rates need to be lower now, of course, than 2 decades ago when the European Monetary Union was created, or 3 decades ago. The problem is, of course, that nominal interest rates cannot drop significantly into negative territory Okay, we know that. Because this might create, creates adverse effects on financial intermediation. Okay, it will have detrimental effects on the supply of credit, on economic activity and inflation, and this is the concept of the lower bound that we all know. But we have to accept that the existence of the lower bound introduces an asymmetry into the conduct of monetary policy, and this asymmetry means that the central bank is potentially very effective in combating high inflation episodes, but less so in combating deflation or even persistently low inflation. So in the years that follow the great financial crisis, and in a context, as I was underlying, of significant disinflationary forces, the proximity of interest rates to the lower bound led the ECB to introduce a set of non-standard measures to provide sufficient monetary stimulus to preserve price stability. So it was a kind of, we tried to circumvent the limits of the lower bound, but by incorporating other instruments, okay? And among these measures, and this is illustrated in this slide, the asset purchase programs, the targeted longer-term refinancing operations, and the forward guidance, including even negative interest rates, are the most well known and those that have been to be highlighted. However, and I come back to this chart on the inflation developments in the euro area during the last decades, even though there is a broad consensus that these non-standard instruments have been effective in easing financing conditions and in supporting, therefore, euro area inflation and euro area economic growth and euro area employment, their expansionary effect did not prevent inflation from remaining persistently below the ECB's target for much of the last decade. And this was, again, one of the main motivations why the ECB considered it was important to start a review of the strategy in order precisely to search for ways to better fulfill our price stability mandate. So, what are the elements of this review? And let me focus on those again, as I was stating at the very beginning of my intervention, those that are more relevant for the current context. Well, first, we adopted a new medium-term inflation target of 2%. This target is also symmetric, and that's absolutely crucial, in the sense that positive and negative deviations of inflation from the target are considered equally undesirable. As a result, the ECB has now a clearer and more credible inflation target, since this 2% target eliminates the possible impression of asymmetry that could stem from the previous target. In many circumstances, it was even perceived as a ceiling. Okay, this has been completely eliminated. And our intention, of course, is here to provide a better and clear anchor for inflation expectations. This definition, and this is again very important for the current context, confirms the medium-term orientation of monetary policy. This is not a novelty. This already exists under the previous strategy. And this medium-term orientation provides room for inevitable short-term deviations of inflation from the target, as well as lags. We know there are lags in implementation of monetary policy, and also there are uncertainty even in the transmission of monetary policy. And this is why we decided not to have, from the very beginning, this medium-term perspective. One should also even consider that the medium-term orientation provides the European Central Bank with the capacity to incorporate into the analysis the origin, the scale, or even the persistence of the shocks. Because, of course, it's not the same from the monetary policy perspective, whether the shock that is hitting the economy is a supply shock or is a demand shock. And this medium-term orientation provides precisely the right framework, the right perspective in order to take into account that the origins of the shocks or the persistence of the shocks might condition the ability of the central bank to provide a stimulus in order to fulfill the mandate. Second element of the new strategy is that very important again in the current context is that the ECB has taken into account the monetary policy implications of the lower bound that I was describing before, okay? And in particular, the new strategy establishes a requirement for especially forceful or persistent monetary policy action when the economy is close to the lower bound. And the idea here, the motivation here is to prevent negative deviations from the inflation target from becoming entrenched, okay? In those circumstances, and I will provide a chart later that I think is very interesting. It provides a clear justification for this attitude of the central bank, which, and this is also very relevant, it might even imply a transitory period of overshooting in which inflation is moderately above target. It's not that we are aiming for overshooting, but by following, okay, this persistence or these forceful actions, we admit that there might be a transitory period of overshooting in which inflation is moderately above target. And the third element of the strategy review that I want to emphasize here today is that the ECB we've made explicit that the set of policy rates, well, remain our primary monetary policy, but at the same time, there is a clear recognition that the rest of the instruments, the so-called non-conventional instruments, are now, of course, part of our tools as well. And of course, we are even ready to define new instruments if considered appropriate. Okay, that was also a very relevant element of the strategy. So, let me illustrate this point of the potential overshooting, because of course is one of the main elements of the strategy, and we need to explain it rightly. So here what you have in this chart is a simulation, okay? The left-hand side figure of the slide shows the evolution of interest rates, while the right-hand side figure shows the evolution of inflation, okay? And the different lines compare a scenario in solid blue line in which the central bank is restricted by the effective lower bound, with another scenario, which is the dashed red line, in which it is not. Okay. In the latter case, if the economy is hit by a disinflationary shock, the central bank would reduce its interest rates and quickly achieve its inflation target. Okay. In the other case, so when we are in a context of being restricted by the effective lower bound, the presence of the lower bound prevents rates from falling as much as required, and hence inflation remains below the target for a protracted period of time, okay? So the idea is that by committing to maintain interest rates at the lower bound for a longer period, okay, or equivalently to overshoot, as you can see in the right-hand chart, our inflation target during the recovery, the central bank manages to increase expected inflation and thus to reduce real rates, which helps the economy to abandon the slump faster, okay? And this not only benefits the real economy, but allows, and this is absolutely crucial, the central bank to fulfill the price stability mandate better, okay? Well, once that we defined the new strategy, what we did immediately, just 2 weeks later, is to change our tools, okay, to make them compatible with the new strategy. And the main element that we changed was our forward guidance on rates, okay? What is forward guidance? Well, forward guidance is that the information provided to the public by the European Central Bank regarding the expected future path of policy rates, okay? And at end July 2020, the ECB revised our forward guidance on interest rates to bring it into line with the new strategy. So in particular, the revised forward guidance incorporates the 2%, of course, symmetry inflation target that I've just described for sure, and establishes 3 conditions that again will be very relevant in order to interpret our action in the current context, okay? 3 conditions that need to be fulfilled before the ECB Governing Council raises rates. First, we have to observe that inflation reaches 2% well ahead of the end of the projection horizon. And the President Lagarde explained following the announcement of the new forward guidance that well ahead basically refers to the midpoint of our projection horizon, normally 18 months, okay? Second condition, inflation must be at 2% durably for the rest of the projection horizon. And third, we must consider that the progress realized, so now we are talking about not about projections, but about observed inflation, in underlying inflation is sufficiently advanced to be consistent with inflation stabilizing at 2% over the medium term. So let me emphasize that these conditions related to the medium-term inflation outlook, but also to underlying observed underlying inflation, the main objective of these three conditions is to avoid a premature tightening of our monetary policy in the face of increases in inflation above target when these are considered to be temporary or caused by some volatile or exogenous element, such as, for example, energy prices. Okay, and this is why this is so relevant also in the interpretation of our actions in the current context. Okay, and finally, let me also mention that here is we have also what we call change forward guidance, because we expect net asset purchases under APP to the asset purchase program of the ECB to end shortly before raising rates. Okay, so the horizon for net asset purchases remain linked to the moment in which the next interest rate hike takes place. Okay, that's of course also the sequencing is also very relevant. So let's now move to the current inflation episode and what the ECB action is been till now, and what are the expectations that we can have for the future, according, of course, to my own views. I think this chart, this table is interesting, no? Because I think it put into context the inflation episode that we are living. Well, we know, of course, headline inflation reached 5.1% in January. Core inflation reached 2.3% in the euro area as a whole. And we also know that there's a lot of analysis that have been published by Banco de España, but also by the ECB, of course, that the surge in inflation is the result of a combination of factors. So let me mention at least 3 or 4 of them. Base effects, okay, which are stemming from the sharp drop in certain prices at the onset of the pandemic. Supply bottlenecks, second element. A steep rise in the prices of energy, especially electricity, we know, in particular here in Spain. And the impact of the recovery in demand on the price of some services. Okay, these are I would say, the 4 main reasons. But in this table, what you have is a comparison of the level of inflation, of the level of prices, and therefore a calculation of inflation in the accumulation of the 2 years. So it's a comparison what the level of inflation was in December 2021 as compared to December 2019. Okay, 2019. Okay, so it's basically looking through the whole pandemic episode. And I think it's very interesting because what you have there is that headline HICP increased by 4.7% in these 2 years. Okay, in the accumulation of these 2 years. But core inflation increased by only 2.9 in these 2 years. Okay. And then if you look to the different components, what you see is that energy increased by 17.2%, food by 4.6% in these 2 years. And then if you move to core inflation, services increased by 3.1%, and non-energy industrial goods increased by 2.3%. Okay, significantly lower, of course, than in particular than energy, but also than food. At the same time, of course, here what we have in this slide is a comparison of the inflation that was projected by the ECB in December 2020, okay, as compared to realized inflation since then, okay? And it's obvious from these two charts for inflation and for core inflation, it's obvious from this chart that inflation has surprised us consistently, okay, on the upside over the last few quarters and also in the most recent months. This is pretty obvious. And perhaps it's also important to emphasize that these surprises do not relate exclusively to the energy and food components of the HICP, but have translated somewhat, at least, also to core inflation as well. And of course, this has to also to be taken into account, no, when considering the analysis and the potential policy reaction of the ECB. In parallel, we also know that as it is intended to be illustrated in this slide, energy futures curves have been steeper throughout the year. This will lead surely to higher inflation in 2022 than we were expecting in December. And this is very important, it increases the probability of second round effects, okay? And in particular, in a context on which we also know there is a continued labor market improvement in the euro area. And let me stress this point, no, because I think it's very relevant. The fact that inflation may remain above 2% for the rest of the year, although of course in a decelerating path, will place upward pressures not only on this year's wage negotiations, but also on those taking place next year. The existence of this backward-looking component in the wage setting process is a stylized empirical fact, and as such is included in some of our forecasting tools. So in a context in which an increasing number of companies are identifying, we know from surveys, labor shortages as a factor limiting the production, well, the result is that the probability of observing second round effects on wages is also higher now, okay? Let me also emphasize that avoiding this feedback process, the second round effects, is in the hands of each country's economic agents, of course. And were it to occur in one euro area country only, it would have an adverse impact on that country's competitiveness, and therefore in its activity and employment in that country. At the same time, one should take into account that although widespread excessive wage increases would in the current context be counterproductive, increases consistent with the productivity growth and demand at individual firms are clearly desirable. And indeed, a balanced wage increase in line with these determinants would contribute to the lasting achievement of our medium-term inflation target, and at the same time, in parallel, to preventing the emergence of undesired second-round effects. Okay, I think this is an important point that I wanted also to make. Of course, another important point from this perspective of the orientation, the medium-term orientation of the strategy of the ECB is what it is illustrated in this chart, is that the expectation is still there that inflation will moderate, okay? This is maintained. So despite the evidence short-run upward pressures on inflation, the most recent surveys, the market-based indicators keep pointing to a medium-term outlook for inflation rates in the euro area broadly in line with our 2% target. And in parallel, we also know, as it was illustrated in the previous slide, wage growth remains moderate, okay? Even if, of course, as I was emphasizing, the probability of second-round effects have increased. So against this backdrop, in recent months, well, probably what we know is that the probability of inflation stabilizing at around 2% in the medium term has clearly increased, but there is no perceived risk of it remaining persistently above that level at this stage. Okay. At the same time, we have also to admit that the outlook for inflation is admittedly highly uncertain. Geopolitical tensions could lead to further increases in energy prices, which could feed back into wage rises and an inflation spiral. And other matters, such as, for example, the resolution of supply bottlenecks, are subject to great uncertainty as well. And all in all, our perception at the Governing Council is that the risk to inflation are on the upside, particularly in the near term. Let me also, I think it's an important point. Let me emphasize some of the differences of the inflation spike in the euro area as compared to the US. Okay, because I think it's also important to to justify a different policy action as well. And this is tried to be illustrated in these 4 charts in the slide. Well, first point, as I said before, medium-term inflation expectations in the euro area, as this is the chart on the left, on the screen left, medium-term inflation expectations in the euro area remain anchored at around our 2% target level. While in the US, these expectations lie significantly above 2%, okay? And even the observed numbers, if we take, for example, January CPI in the US increased year on year by 7.5%, while in the euro area, HICP rose by 5.1%. Second point, it should be noted as well that while in the euro area, both GDP and private consumption, and this is the third chart here in this slide, in the euro area, both GDP and private consumption are still far from their pre-pandemic trends. In the US, these measures of broad economic activity have fully recovered, partly as a consequence of the more forceful fiscal policy response in this country to the COVID-19 crisis. Third point, while, and this is illustrated in the second chart, while a significant part of the current inflationary process in the euro area is driven by exogenous and external factors, such as energy prices, to which the euro area economy, by the way, is particularly sensitive. In the US, there are significant domestic pressures, especially in the form of extraordinary wage growth, which contrasts with the relatively subdued dynamics in euro area wages so far. And as an illustration, core inflation stayed in the euro area, as I was mentioning, at 2.3, while in the US was 6% in January, okay? And then finally, a rather significant part, and this is illustrated in the right chart in this slide, a rather significant part of the current high inflation episode in the euro area can be interpreted as a negative shock to our terms of trade, okay, given our high dependency on external sources of energy. And again, this is very different to the situation in the US, and therefore its consequences are also expected to differ. And in this regard, one could even say that high inflation and subdued wage growth, like we have observed so far in the euro area, imply a substantial decline in real incomes, which could translate into lower consumption, into lower investment, and therefore into weaker underlying inflation dynamics beyond the immediate short term. And even though part of these negative effects have been mitigated so far by fiscal policy in many countries, where measures have concentrated on compensating at least partially low-income households for the higher energy prices, looking ahead, it is unclear how persistent this policy support may be. So in other words, this represents, it might be also a downward risk to inflation. And let me now end what are, in my view, the implications for monetary policy, you know, of all this characterization of the recent inflation dynamics that I've tried to describe. So how monetary policy should react, and let me connect this also with the monetary policy strategy review that I was also explaining and describing at the beginning of this intervention. Well, first point, in this setting of heightened uncertainty is the key word here. We have underlined, the Governing Council have underlined that the need to maintain optionality and flexibility and to remain attentive to incoming data and forecasts in order to correctly adjust our monetary policy stance. As we have stated on numerous occasions, the ECB stands ready to act at any time and to adjust all of its instruments as deemed appropriate. But I insist, the near term is plagued with uncertainty in terms of pure inflation dynamics, but also in relation to several geopolitical risks, which could potentially be highly disruptive. And this is why, more than ever now, we must maintain this optionality and flexibility. This is the first point. Second, forward guidance remains the anchor for monetary policy. As I explained before, for our first interest rate hike to be implemented, all three conditions should be met. Another crucial element, I was also emphasizing this point of this forward guidance, is the sequencing of the exit strategy, whereby we will not raise interest rates until net purchases under our APP have come to an end. Third point, given what I've just said regarding inflation prospects, we cannot rule out the possibility that all the conditions of our forward guidance will be met sooner than we had expected some months ago. And as a result, movements in our monetary policy towards normalizations seem now more likely. Okay, this is also obvious. In the coming months, we'll have to decide how to exercise our optionality. And on this how, the key word should be, in my view, gradualism. In other words, I see no reason to overreact. And this view is based on several considerations. Well, first, we have to take into account that the length of the medium term, okay, which again, I was emphasizing is the orientation of the ECB, is dependent, is not independent on the state of the economy, okay? When demand shocks prevail, it is shorter, the definition of this medium term, and closer to the standard transmission lag of around 2 years. But when supply shocks prevail and there are no serious risks that inflation expectations might be contaminated by the effect that these shocks usually have on actual inflation, the medium-term horizon tends to be longer because of the resulting trade-off between inflation and economic activity. Okay, a point that I was also trying to make before. Therefore, in a context in which inflation expectations remain anchored at around our 2% symmetric target and confronted with an exogenous price shock, while still in a context of economic slack, a premature tightening of monetary policy would only add to the negative consequence of that shock for demand and therefore for medium-term inflation. So if we add to this that we are in a highly uncertain scenario, including geopolitical tensions in Ukraine, in my view, the ECB should not constitute an additional source of uncertainty, but rather maintain a clear, a gradual and predictable path for its policy. And this gradualism is also justified, in my view, by the fact that our estimates, the estimates that I was providing before, of the natural interest rate in the euro area remain very low, which should serve as an anchor as to the level around which our policy rates might stabilize in the longer run. Indeed, the nominal interest rate that markets, this is the one that it is illustrated in this slide, appear to consider the terminal level for our rate cycle is extremely low. And according to optimal monetary policy theory, the lower the terminal rate, the longer one should spend at the lower bound, and the more gradual should be the rise towards the terminal rate after lift off. And finally, let me also add an important dimension, which is this time related to flexibility, okay, in our monetary policy, that we should not overlook, and is the one that is put the focus on avoiding financial fragmentation in the euro area. In particular, when, as we know, the impact of the pandemic has been and remains very heterogeneous across sectors and across countries. In December last year, we decided to retain this flexibility in the PPP, in the pandemic program reinvestment phase. We even extended this investment phase by 1 year till the end of 2024. And it is my view that we should now use this flexibility proactively and monitor whether it is sufficient to ensure our monetary policy is appropriately transmitted across the euro area. So let me now conclude. I'm convinced, I hope that I was sufficiently clear. I'm convinced that the ECB's new monetary policy strategy constitutes a solid basis for the conduct of our monetary policy. This is so not just looking ahead to the coming decades, but also for coping with the current high inflation episode. In this respect, I believe that in a highly uncertain environment, a careful assessment of the implications that current developments have on medium-term inflation expectations is key, and that the optionality and flexibility that we retain should be exercised gradually and predictably. The direction in which we need to head is clear, but we should not draw premature conclusions as to the time frame. The process, in my view, will have to be both gradual and data dependent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for your inspiring speech. I'm going to be very brief in order not to lower the level of the presentation of the yearbook that I think has been excellent. So thank you very much for attending this webinar in which we have presented and discussed the work carried out jointly by the two institutions, the Fundación ICO and the Fundación de Estudios Financieros, entitled A Yearbook of the Euro 2022. I would like to thank Fundación ICO, its president, José Carlos García de Quevedo, and his team for his fruitful collaboration that has led to the jointly sponsored 9th edition of the yearbook. At the Fundación de Estudios Financieros, we are very satisfied with the result of this collaboration, and it's our wish to maintain it over time. We believe that the Euro Yearbook is consolidated itself as a reference at a European level, as shown by the excellent feedback we receive each year after the yearbook's presentation. I also want to thank the collaboration carried out with Bruegel that allow us to increase the outreach of this study. I would like also to thank the Secretary of State of Economy and Support to Businesses for his participation in this interesting debate, together with Maria de Mercis from Bruegel. Finally, I would like to thank Uría Menéndez, a distinguished Fundación de Estudios Financieros sponsors, for hosting us today at their premises from where we have transmitted the presentation of the subsequent debate. The study is a collective task in which experts from the academic and professional field have participated, coordinated by Fernando Fernández Méndez de Andés, who has carried out a great job in terms of production and direction of the work that we are presenting today. Fernando, we sincerely thank you once again for the effort to make room for us in your intense academic and professional activity. To all those who have participated in the study, many of which are joining us today at this webinar, I want to convey my thankfulness and congratulations for the excellent work done and for their dedication and support of this initiative of the Fundación ICO and Fundación de Estudios Financieros. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we're done, Maria.
Katja, yeah. Thanks, Katja. That was great. Do we have the slides of the governor?
No, I don't think he sent them. I can ask them if you want to
Please.
revisit
Yeah,
them.
if it would be. I mean, all the slides are public, so they should be. They will be put at some point at the. Are we online?
No, we're not online.
Okay.